Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Wicked Podcast. Today I'm talking to Peter Nixey and we're talking all things AI and how it affects teamwork and design work and generally how it has changed ways of working, production and so on. He's been working on this for nearly a year and he's seen early versions of it and later versions of it. So we had a really interesting conversation about where it goes, how fast it develops and what it means for modern work. I hope you enjoy.
Before the interview, a quick word from our very first sponsor, Zencastr. We use Zencastr for all our audio and video recording, and it's a very nifty tool that splits up all the channels for very easy editing. Zencastr is used by 10% of all active podcasts. You can get 40% off the first 3 months and unlimited audio and video recordings with our special coupon code WICKEDPODCAST. I repeat, Wicked Podcast for 40% off. And now the interview. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wicked Podcast. Today I have Peter Nixey with me. Hello, Peter, and thank you for making time.
Hello, Marcus. Thank you for having me.
So, as usual, we start at the top. So, please tell our audience who you are and what you do.
I am Peter Nixey. I'm the founder of Intentional.io, which is a platform to help you get more of the things that you care about getting done each day done. And I've been an entrepreneur and a technologist and a developer for pretty much 20 years now.
Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons why we talk today is like you 2 months ago you posted a very, very popular a post that got very popular on LinkedIn around AI and some of its effects that we might not see. Could you elaborate, please, on the post and sort of what the purpose of the post was and sort of the angle of what you tried to ask and express there, please?
Yeah, I observed that as I got more familiar with GPT 3.5 and then subsequently started to feel the even greater power of GPT 4, that a lot of the work that I was doing and the questions that I was asking to get that work done in the realm of programming were migrating off the web and onto ChatGPT. And so I've been using it a lot since January, when it was just 3.5, and found it a really, really useful tool. And then 4 came out and was noticeably more powerful, noticeably more capable, noticeably more able to deal with novel problems and give helpful solutions to them. And with that, I realized that I was stopping posting questions on Stack Overflow. So Stack Overflow is the preeminent Q&A site for software developers on the web. It's a huge, huge site. The average software developer up until last year would use Stack Overflow several times, multiple times during a day to search for questions and to get answers. And I was one of the people on Stack Overflow who actually asked quite a lot of questions. So I've got questions going back a decade on Stack Overflow, which has actually put me in the top 2% of Stack Overflow users. It's put me in that top 2%, I would say, by being representatively ignorant rather than representatively brilliant, in that it's generally that I've asked questions that a lot of other people have subsequently had that that's got me to gather all of these virtual internet points. But the observation that I'd made in this post was that in the very, very brief window of time, I transitioned from going and asking these questions on Stack Overflow in a way that prompted other humans to answer those questions on Stack Overflow and created a corpus of information that yet other humans could come along to and learn from and improve their programming. To all of a sudden now, I'm in a paradigm where I'm asking these questions to GPT-4, and nobody else is seeing them, and nobody else is having them shared with them. And in principle, at least, those conversations are private. I mean, actually, we found out what we always suspected, that they weren't really private. But there had been this change in the fundamental nature of information sharing, in that I'd switched from sharing information with other humans in a way that future humans could benefit from, to all of a sudden this channel of information going directly into one company in a way that they controlled and didn't fundamentally, at core, well, whether or not it benefited other humans, it certainly wasn't shared with other humans. And so the post was kind of reflecting on the significance of that.
So apart from the fact that, and it's been the same for me, especially when I was more coding, which is more years ago. I mean, same thing, Stack Overflow and GitHub and all these things, amazing platforms for the developing community just to exchange, help each other, and people answering each other's questions and providing each other code pieces and so on. So what do you think then is the ramification of that? Apart from the obvious less usage of the platforms themselves, but what do you reckon that means for then the interaction between human beings and the developers, or the data that's on the platform when it's not shared between people, but just machines? What do you think the difference then of that is, apart from that it's different touch points, so to speak?
And the thing about it that was most interesting and most significant to me was this idea that we were, if you take that as a canary in a coal mine, and it may not be, right? But if you take that transition from people sharing information with each other in public forums to all of a sudden people just interacting with a machine, then what I found really significant in that is that we as humans start to lose control over that information. Because when it's out there on the internet, anybody can archive it, anybody can index it, and Google indexes Stack Overflow, Bing indexes Stack Overflow. You can just go and crawl Stack Overflow and take all of the data from it, should you wish. But all these questions that I was now asking to GPT-4 were in principle just lost. Like, I would ask it the question that kind of, it certainly isn't public to the rest of the internet. I mean, as we now know, suspected from the start, OpenAI is using these interactions to further train the LLM itself. But there's something very significant when you stop that public discourse and that public corpus of information starts to vanish, and our interactions, instead of being group interactions with each other and group creation of knowledge, start to become point interactions between a whole hub of humans and a whole set of spokes reaching out to individual humans, and a hub, which is this AI at the center. And there's something odd about that switch in the nature of kind of collective knowledge. It's like we stop writing books for each other and we just go straight to the AI. So that I found a bit uncomfortable.
How do you think this might compare? Because in theory, not in theory, but in my head, and maybe I'm being naive on that, if I compare it to some of the development environments that you have, some software can, autocomplete some of the code. So there's some really smart ones, some less smart ones, right? Which do some smart things for you as well, where you look at it and you're essentially asking it by starting to write code, this is what I want to do, and it helps you with more complete code snippets. That seems it's doing a little bit of that, whereas ChatGPT obviously does it way more extensively. Do you think there's sort of a comparison here in terms of machine interaction in itself? Do you think it's just an extension of that, or do you think it's more significant than that?
Can you would you mind rephrasing the question? Because I want to make sure I understood it before answering it.
Yeah, so if you look at some of the dev environments, software that previously could already autocomplete code, right? And autocompleting code and ChatGPT giving you answers in code you could look at that as a similar thing, similar feature, just one that's incredibly more powerful than the other. But the basic interaction is sort of the same. Do you think they're more related to each other, or do you think there's a step change that really changes things? For example, maybe another example to give you is back in the days when it was really, really hard to upload video online, it was sort of half a project just to get a video online and display it. Whereas then when YouTube came along and suddenly everyone could do it in a split second, it gear shifted things into, suddenly you had channels and then you had influencers on top, and it created very different ecosystems, behaviors and things on top. Maybe there's another example of how something started quite small and simple, and when it became more powerful, what the machine could do, it shifted the behavior around it. So you think it's more, you can understand it as a simple upgrade of it, or you think it's significantly different?
So I think there's two different. I mean, I think there's lots of different questions around it, but one of the dimensions which you're highlighting is the significance of it in terms of the value that it brings to me as a developer and to other developers, and just how much it accelerates development. I think if you take that question, it's huge, and in some ways, I think it's just scratching the surface of what's going to happen and what's possible. Even, I suspect, with the existing intelligence of the existing this existing GPT-4 model. So that is one question, and I think there's lots of interesting things to talk about in that. The separate question, and I'm not presuming to assume which one is the more interesting one in the context of our conversation, but the separate question for me is this. Like, and the core of the post was this question about, like, leaving aside code, but just this idea of what happens if we stop producing information and sharing it with each other and collectively owning that information. Because whomever owns the copyright to a book, everybody who has a copy of the book has the ability to take that book on into the future and make replicas of that book. But we're moving from this environment in which we all have a collective copy of Stack Overflow, or we all have a collective copy of a book, to all of a sudden the question's not getting asked on Stack Overflow because they're going into OpenAI. But maybe some of the books not necessarily being written because there's not necessarily the appetite for the book. Like, I used to buy a lot of O'Reilly books back in the day, like when I first started programming. And then, to be honest, Stack Overflow in some ways kicked the legs out from under them, because a lot of the questions that I might have had was answered there, and there was much more online documentation. But at least that information was still there and was still being added to and was still being evolved in the public domain. This feels very different. This is like everything switching to being owned by OpenAI, and that, I think, that's scary. I think, like, if you look at it in contrast to Google obviously has a ton of. If you even look at it in the context of Google's mission statement, which is to index and make the world's information readily accessible, they're not gating the world's information, they're adding a layer of value on top of it. Whereas OpenAI has diverted all of the streams of information at source and is now pouring them directly into the OpenAI black box, which is great for them. And in the short term, it is great for me as a developer. It's a much, much better experience. But in the long run, is it great that all of this information that used to be in the public corpus is now owned by OpenAI? Like, owned by OpenAI? That doesn't feel so healthy to me.
So do you think it's maybe comparable to, just because you got fruit delivered every day to your doorstep, you don't have to be a farmer anymore, and you don't have to use your garden anymore, and that kind of thing, in terms of delivering more to the system because the system is delivering to you already what you need. Is that what you're trying to say? Because you mentioned a bit.
Well, I can't think the connection. Go on, sorry, Marcus, you go ahead.
Yeah, so you said something along the lines of, people might not bother writing books anymore, or maybe answering those questions anymore themselves, because they now think, oh, there's a machine out there that answers everything anyways. So do you think in the end we're going to stagnate a little bit of feeding new ideas and new kind of ways of doing into the machine, and the machine, we're just expecting the machine to know the answer anyway.
Yeah, I guess that. I think it's more about my fear is more around the nature of kind of distributed ownership and key man risk in terms of human knowledge. So if you look at the past 20 years of software software development, like this we can look at through the lens of software development, just because I know it well, but I think this applies to a lot of different fields. Like everything, if you skipped from the year 2000 through to where we are now, 2023, and you said, where does the bulk of the information reside and who owns it? Well, there's a lot more information and it's in the public domain and it's generally available to everybody. And if you want to train an LLM on it, or if you want to train your son on it, then everybody can access it. But if we jump from 2023 through to 2043 and nobody's asking questions on Stack Overflow, nobody's asking questions on Mumsnet, nobody is asking questions on BMW owners forums, everybody is asking those questions to OpenAI, then we get to a really weird place where the world's knowledge now is owned by OpenAI, and where the world's knowledge hasn't been contributed to by the world's individuals and hasn't been influenced by the surface area of those individuals' experience. Like the experience of going to GPT-4 and asking it a lot of questions about programming is amazing. But part of the reason for that is that GPT-4 has itself trained on Stack Overflow. It has gleaned from the collective knowledge and experience of millions of programmers up until 2021. And it's taken that collective knowledge and experience and exposed it onto me in a distilled, like hyper useful format. But then what happens between 2023 or 2021, where its training cutoff was? I mean, 2023 is the more interesting date because this is the date that Stack Overflow starts to and empirically seems to be dying. Its traffic is down 5% a month, month on month since, or year on year since GPT, well, since the start of this year. Like, what is that collective information in 20 years' time? 20 years' time is a long time on the internet, but there is something like different and unsettling about this new paradigm. I say that jumping full on into it, by the way. I mean, I use it every day. I don't now ask questions on Stack Overflow because it's easier to go to GPT-4. But in the grand scheme of things, I'm just not sure whether this is a great outcome.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a bit of a Pandora's box where, we're now hearing stories already where some people say, we have to stop and be careful using it, yet everyone's already using it. So that you can't put that toothpaste back into the tube, right? So do you think sort of, so apart from the copyright aspects that you mentioned also, it sounds the way you describe it, correct me if I'm hearing this right, that, the more complex or more distributed dynamic of feeding information into the internet by thousands and millions of people will be different, simplified, maybe commoditized too much by just going to the system or just using the system. Which sounds to me a bit like, there's just one provider of, let's say, bananas. So all you get is this one type of banana, and everyone likes the banana. It's fine. Everyone likes bananas, so everyone eats them all day. But in the end, you just get this one type, and all the other things that potentially could exist just don't exist anymore. So do you think it's a bit of a? Do you think it might bring a bit of scarcity in terms of, new ideas, innovation, and so on, that we might not even know exists because it's not driven by a million different people with different brains? You think there's that danger as well? Because I know, from a if we're talking software developer, area again. I mean, if I look over the last 20 years, how many different frameworks people came up with that looked some quite different to the ones before. There were new ones all the time, evolved differently than an AI might be able to do it. I don't know. That's a big question, right? Do you see some of that there in terms of, let's say, if you talk innovation or complexity of thought?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Again, I'll try and answer it. I feel like if I try and answer it outside of my field of expertise, then it's basically just hearsay. I guess the thing that's missing, but if you take away creativity, I'm going to take away creativity maybe as the lens so much. Well, all right, let's look at it through two different lenses. One is experimentation. The other one is, and let's use creativity or kind of novelty as a second one. So a lot of the questions that a developer needs answered can't be at this stage, like they can't be derived. Like they really are kind of like travel informed, world weary questions. Look, if this happens, then do this, because that has just been found experimentally to work. That sharing of that type of knowledge, I mean, maybe you could argue that GPT-4 won't answer those questions by virtue of not being able to do the experimentation. It's not an AI that currently has the tooling to go out and build software and learn what it's like to create software. It's learning through the shared experience of all human beings, and specifically through the shared experience of all written content by human beings in the materials that it's ingested. So I guess to the extent that you could make an argument that maybe novel problems will still require human beings to go and ask questions to other human beings. I don't know how far we are away from the AI being able to actually code, and by code I mean code in the sense of build, like, and learn from the building, build with an objective. It can create really good code already, but it's not running or executing that code, and it's not really learning from the result. In fact, like, in many ways, it's not learning from anything at the moment. Like, it's creating a new set of static conversations which are used to train the new AI, but it doesn't learn in the way that you and I learn. Like, if it creates, as far as we know, it doesn't like have a conversation and then have another conversation that's more informed as a result of that. Like, it has a conversation, all of this goes into a bank that gets used to improve the model further down the line. So in terms of novelty and experimentation, I think that it's not there yet. It doesn't have the capabilities. What we're going to see over the coming years, I feel like nothing is off limits now. Like, I never thought I would see a computer be able to do the things that GPT-4 is able to do. And so I don't now write anything off. In terms of creativity, I guess in software, I would put it in a similar bucket. I think I would be a bit out of my branch if I tried to guess in terms of other fields.
So, and I know we're having a very, assumptive conversation here because we're only at the beginning of this. We only just started using it and how it works. But maybe talking a bit more about how it has influenced your work so far and what you've seen, and what it does and what you're still doing. And we just started touching on that as well. There's obviously, because of it's being so hyped up, there's a lot of companies are going to more and anew use this now. So when you say we want to be a bit careful in how we're using it and where this all goes, what would you tell developers then, therefore, when they use it, to what's the watch-out to maintain, maybe, therefore, in order to keep the good stuff, the human to human good stuff around, and where you say, well, but here's the benefit on your automated process, on making your work faster and so on. did you have anything so far to call out when you say, wary about the human connection, but I've used it, so this is all fine. But there's this one thing where I'm like, yeah, that thing I still want to do. That thing is where I still want to rather, talk to other developers and keep that in mind when I'm working myself on the, let's say, creative side of coding. And by creative, not mean coming up with amazing innovations, just about how do you structure that, how do you do your work, what pieces do you consider, everything that it does not do yet. I would still consider for me as a designer and coder, that's a creative aspect of coding, where there's multiple approaches here, and you will just still decide which approach you take, right? And then you tell ChatGPT to look at that area in that particular way, right? So what area would you say? What call out would you tell people then?
I guess maybe you can answer this from a selfish perspective and a group perspective. So what makes the most sense for a developer with regard to their own productivity and progress, and then what makes the most sense to the group? With regard to the group, I'm pretty cynical about asking people to do things that are for the collective good unless they're very well incentivized. In fact, let me just rephrase that. I'm cynical about asking people to do things that are not their primary incentive to do. And what's your primary incentive to do can end up being your primary incentive by virtue of being more convenient, more attractive, or by virtue of enough societal conditioning that you feel a desire to do it. It's like, it's not more convenient for me to separate recycling than it is for me to throw it all in one place. But I feel, whether or not, who knows what actually happens to my recycling, but I feel such a strong conditioning and drive to do it by virtue of what's happening to the world and by virtue of what I understand will happen to the recycling, which hopefully means it doesn't just all get burnt or recombined, or shipped off to China and put into landfill anyway. But I feel that, like, selfishly, I feel a drive. It makes me feel better to separate my recycling, so I do it. With regard to software development or kind of anyone's personal work, I think we either have to create systems that mean that it is just optimal for somebody to do something in the way that's more optimal for society, either by virtue of it immediately giving the user the better result, or by the virtue of enough conditioning that we change somebody's value system such that they want to do something. They want to go a bit out of their way to do that recycling separation. But I'm not super confident in that particular mechanism, especially when it comes to developers. Funnily enough, actually, one of the things you mentioned is one of the places that I'm now finding even more value in GPT-4, which is actually the novel part of it. So I think I've been coding for so long and I have so much to do that the bits that maybe used to give me joy in terms of figuring out what an interesting way to do a problem is and so on, actually now I'm just like, I want to, what I'm most interested in is really good quality code out at the end. Like, the process of getting to that, the more efficient that process is, the better. And so I actually now do a lot of the upfront discussion in terms of architecture with GPT-4 before even writing the code. And then I use it for the stuff that I was using it back in January, which is like essentially as kind of a souped up search engine stroke Stack Overflow answering specific questions. But I'm now using it much more aggressively right at the top of the flow as well to do this architectural level of design.
Interesting. And I look at the time, we're already having, as usual, more questions than time. So let's see how we can slightly wrap this up. So maybe one question I haven't asked, because I've only been selfishly asking the questions that popped in my head when I read your post. So you got a lot of response to it. What are sort of the top one or two questions or areas of questions that you've gotten and conversations you had since the post? Because I think you told me when we exchanged emails, you had a lot of response to it. There's a lot of new connections you had. I'm sure you had some conversations with other people about it. What were sort of the things that stuck out, as a reaction to your post?
Well, the post happened at exactly the same time. I posted the post 2 days before our son was born, and so I've kind of it blew up, and but at the same time, I was like completely distracted. I was completely absorbed with him and this new little life coming into the world. So I'm only actually really processing through a lot of the responses now. Weirdly, there wasn't really much controversy in terms of what people posted. So a lot of people were just saying, "Oh, this is interesting," and reposting it. There were a couple of tweets that went into my entertaining rage label. People who kind of got quite angry with me and told me that I can't remember what they were saying, but like for some reason I pushed their buttons. But that happened very, very, very little, especially given the amount of exposure that the post got. I'm just now starting. I was trying to figure out how to go through. I had 1,000 inbound LinkedIn connections. I just didn't know what to do with them. I mean, a connection to me on LinkedIn is somebody I should be able to like refer somebody to, or like would be happy to refer somebody to. So if I'm just clicking yes, it's meaningless. I've just started now going through some of those and speaking to some of the people who kind of left a personal note and having conversations. I think that the thing that I've learned, which doesn't exactly answer your question, but is possibly the thing that's interesting to me, is that the whole space is still very raw. It's a funny space in that this consumer product has gone from zero to fastest distribution of any product ever in human history. The business world has gone from zero to holy crap, generative AI could do everything for us. And in between that state of mind and state of engagement with ChatGPT and reality is almost the entire distance that we were 7 months ago. Like, people don't really know how to integrate it into stuff. The people, they're not. I think there's a huge gap in an understanding, even for individuals using ChatGPT, on how ChatGPT can really be useful to them. I think understanding how to get the most out of it, understanding what its capabilities are. I still think most people don't really realize that it's not a search engine. And it's not a search engine, and that's a very bad use of the product. And then if you go beyond that to businesses starting to really understand how they can inject intelligence in a like programmatic form into their processes, I think there's a huge amount of lag. There's a huge amount of lag between where the internet. I'm not going to say the hype cycle, because I do think that the hype is real. So I think that that's dismissive of it. But I think that where the GPT fanboys are on the internet with 20 things that will blow your mind about how you can use GPT and the reality of where everybody is, there's a huge distance between those two things.
I mean, that's a really, really good assessment, I think, and probably a good point to wrap up on, I would say. And I'm also doing that. I mean, I'd love to ask a couple of more questions, but I know you're just being a new dad. You probably didn't have a lot of sleep over the last 2 months, I'm pretty sure. And as you told me, you just come out of another conversation just before this recording. So I'll let you go for this time. Maybe we'll catch up in another 7 months or a year and see where we are at this point, because as you pointed out, there's a lot of interesting stuff going out. No one can quite make sense of it, even the people who use it, and definitely the people who haven't even been using it. So it's exciting times for sure. So I'd just say at this point, thank you so much, Peter, for making time. I know you're tired, so I'm not going to keep you longer, and thank you for talking to me.
Real pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Marcus.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedAndBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.